Welcome everyone. Thank you very much for coming again. It's a very good audience. I'm very pleased. I'm sure that this is in large part due to the presence of our guest. And since I am very frequently in touch with the German-speaking world, I will probably tend to call him Zimmerman rather than Zimmerman. So I hope you will not. I hope you will forgive me for this habit of tongue, as it were. Right. A very brief capitulation so that we stay in the sequence of what we've been doing in the seminar. We started off with the relativity and with the rationality and relativism debate, which had involved, as you will all remember from the various readings and discussions, we started with Stephen Luke's, which was really a discussion among anthropologists and philosophers in the 1970s and 1980s. That was before the intervention of two crucial cultural factors and scientific factors that had intervened in the meantime, namely the spectacular, very rapid rise of the cognitive study of religion on the one hand, and of course postmodernist relativism in epistemology on the other, together conjugated with the rising salience of religious sentiments and religious expressions. It brings us to the sorts of questions with which we are concerned today. Those of you who attended the session the week before last will remember that Professor Philipse had argued actually that there was a small, rather specifically 4 types of arguments for theism, and that all 4 types of arguments, it are the only types of arguments possible for theism, that all 4 types are not cogent and do not convince. He was arguing a large part against the views of Plattinger, and among other things, Plattinger had argued that his arguments were in fact rational but non-perceptual, right? Premised simply upon faith, ultimately. Now, there is another body of theistic arguments which bases its conviction precisely upon questions that have to do with perception. And this is where the cognitive science of religion might be passed together with theistic arguments, or with arguments for the existence of God. There's a particular twist where perception-like directness of experience of divinity is taken for actual perception of the supernatural. Now, of course, this can be sustained by arguments from the cognitive science of religion, of humans as believing primates by nature, prone to MCI. You would remember the MCI, minimal counterintuitiveness of beliefs in supernatural agents. HADD, again, another technical term, hyperactive agency detection devices, or indeed studies of children's perception of absent agents, where they impute presence and they impute agency to absent actors. So this is all grist to the mill of the arguments for what Professor Zimmerman calls a God faculty, right? A God faculty among humans, which might serve, and I quote, as an overall explanation for why people would have a simple and innate concept of God. Now, of course, there are a number of arguments that one could put forward as an alternative to the kinds of conclusions that one might arrive at from the cognitive study of religion. One might simply say that a phantasm is, after all, only a phantasm. One might say that states of possession, states of abstraction, states of absorption are really more a matter for psychiatry than for philosophy or for theology, or indeed for anthropology. One might argue that children's perceptions of absent agents might be precisely what it is, that is to say, infantile, and that religious conceptions are humanity in an infantile state, as Freud would have argued. Or simply one might argue from natural selection. Now, some of you will probably be aware that Daniel Dennett has just produced a new book entitled From Bacteria to Bach and Back, which is indeed, and incidentally, Daniel Dennett is the author of a famous book called The God Delusion. Essential reading, in my mind, the first one, especially From Bacteria to Bach, for anyone curious as to how humans came to be at all curious, as a matter of fact, in which religion is simply the transmission of a number of memes, and he does give some room for religion in a Darwinian sense in a way that inverts any arguments from agency, intelligent design, and so on and so forth. Now, all, of course, goes against what I have read from our guest, Professor Zimmerman, and I quote, "It becomes readily imaginable that studying empirically whether there are in fact dedicated computational and representational resources for perceiving God using cognitive and neuroscientific techniques could provide evidence about whether we have been in serious causal contact with God over the course of our evolution." This, of course, is a very interesting question, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Please.
Thanks. So, in hope that my jet lag, which is better now, I've been here a few days, won't kick in, I'll stand up. That'll make it less likely that I'll just kind of fade away. I should start out by saying a couple of things about the genesis of this paper. The version that you were sent was still preliminary, and it's changing even as we speak. My co-author, Mark Baker, is making little changes I see every once in a while in my Dropbox. The origin of the paper is that Mark Baker, who is a linguist at Rutgers and a part of the Cognitive Science Center, became interested in cognitive science of religion around the same time I did, and we decided, well, let's work on this together. He's a student of Chomsky and mainly known for his work in syntax, but he's been involved in cognitive science for quite a while. And so much of the contact with the CSR literature is through him, and he tells me what to read, and he helps me interpret it. So some of the stuff in the paper that he's primarily responsible for, I won't be talking about much today because I'm not the expert. So the section on whether the concept of God is innate or simple and that sort of stuff, I'm sort of leaving that to him, and also I need to leave something out. Also, the evolutionary psychology fable, that's entirely his doing, but I admire it a good deal, so I'll bring that in. So my role was primarily as sort of the philosopher to think about perception a bit and what CSR might come to include if it took the idea that God is perceivable more seriously than it does. I think one thing that's happened in recent versions of the paper that you haven't seen, our criticisms of existing CSR have been toned down a little bit as we've run this by some of our friends who actually work in that area. But still, I think we would like to see exploration of what we regard as a kind of neglected avenue. So let's see. Let's move this over here a little bit. So the things I want to talk about, I'm not sure we'll get to all of these things, but I wanted to mention things that you have already talked about some. The standard toolkit of what is called cognitive science of religion. Then draw attention to modern religious experiences that we think play quite a role in the support of and the retention of religious belief in the modern period. Weaknesses of existing cognitive science of religion and explaining them, and by and large, it doesn't take them as its explanatory target. And then this is where I come in as sort of the philosopher speculating a bit. I want to ask the question, what would be required in order for some of these experiences, thank you, to count as perception of God? And that requires thinking about what counts as perception. And there I'm going to borrow a bit from Alvin Goldman. Mark Baker and I taught a grad seminar on this material last spring, and Alvin kindly attended, and we borrowed from him in ways that he probably wouldn't have used these tools for these purposes, but they're excellent tools, and we thank him for those. So I'll spend most of my time there probably, and then tell Mark's little fable, which makes it seem plausible that dedicated mechanisms for perceiving God might actually arise in a very natural sort of way, and then end with some epistemological reflections. Okay, so the standard cognitive science of religion, and in talking with Justin Barrett about, we had Justin Barrett come to Rutgers to meet with our seminar. He's one of the seminal figures in the cognitive science of religion. He, I think, was instrumental in coining the term, and it was a bit of an accident that cognitive science of religion was the name of this discipline. It makes use of tools from evolutionary psychology and anthropology, and it doesn't look all that much like cognitive science as, for instance, Chomsky would think of it, or the people who do cognitive science of perception. They're interested in whether the mind is modular, or the parts of it that do seem to be modular, where there's input and output that can be studied and seems to be more or less universal. It's a little bit, it's more evolutionary psychology than cognitive science in the way that, say, Fodor would have thought of cognitive science. And granted, that's a sort of narrow understanding of cognitive science, and people who do cognitive science have expanded their understanding of what should fall under that term. But it uses tools from evolutionary psychology and other places to try to explain why people from essentially all cultures take ordinary human experiences of living in the world and then map them onto distinctively religious beliefs. Paramount among these beliefs are beliefs in supernatural agents, and that these supernatural agents exist and interact with us. You can argue about what we should mean by religion, religious beliefs, and it's going to be very hard to come to any sort of agreement about what we should use the term religion to mean. What phenomena should we draw a circle around and say, these are religious and everything else is not? That's going to be very hard to do. Cognitive science of religion has sort of bypassed that very difficult question and said, well, look, here's a phenomenon that needs to be explained. People are believing in immaterial, supernatural entities in every culture, everywhere, basically. So, including cultures which there's been so little interaction amongst them for so long, it would seem there must be some kind of built-in tendency in the human mind, in the same way that Chomsky finds universal grammatical structure, or universal, what do they call them, parameters, that all languages seem to be obeying. There's something built in, some kind of built-in tendencies. And so this is the target to explain why it is that these kinds of beliefs arise all over the place, especially assuming, which I assume as well as the practitioners of CSR, I assume that we have not been in contact with elves and Zeus and spirits in the woods and so on. So why do we believe in these things? This is a perfectly good target for explanation, and CSR includes a lot of smart people who are helping us to understand this, and neither Mark Baker nor I want to deny that. But let's see. But we can ask how well it does with modern religious belief in our culture, for instance. So the toolkit includes things like the hyperactive agency detector, a tendency to discover agency when it might not be there, a sort of hair trigger tendency to be alert for agents in the environment, especially if the agents may be predators or prey. Theory of mind mechanism, a tendency to attribute agency to read minds, including when there are no minds there. So if there are things that look like eyes, you ascribe mentality. Promiscuous teleology. We have a tendency to see things as designed. Rocks are pointy so that people won't sit on them. Somebody must have made them pointy, then, if that was the goal. That leads to the seeing of design in nature where there isn't, at least not obviously, design. Minimally counterintuitive concepts. This idea, Pascal Boyer is the person primarily responsible for it, but it's been put to a great deal of use. Some concepts are sort of surprising, but not too surprising. And because they're surprising, they're easy to remember. Because they're not too surprising, we know how to infer things from them. So they're inferentially rich. And so they have a tendency to catch on. So listening trees, invisible agents of various kinds can be catchy and spread easily. And the hypothesis is that some of these spirit agent concepts or supernatural plants and things of that sort were minimally counterintuitive and caught on easily, and that this happens everywhere in all different kinds of environment. So in all different kinds of cultures. What else do we have? This big gods idea is it's not so much in the hardwire that the brain is hardwired in a certain way, that sort of thing. It's more social evolution, cultural evolution. It's a cultural evolution kind of explanation for the prevalence of a certain kind of supernatural beings. So one finds supernatural beings who are believed in, but that don't demand very much of us. They exist out there in the woods, or they exist on the mountain, but they don't care terribly much about what we do. Maybe they want us to make some sacrifices or something, but they're not obsessed with us, and they're not powerful beyond a certain region. Well, big gods are gods that know everything and care intensely about what we do. Mark and I think, and we are admittedly kind of newcomers to this, and we haven't done any studies of our own. All we're doing is we're reading the literature. But we find the minimally counterintuitive concept explanatory strategy to not take you very far in explaining how an omnipotent, omniscient, intensely concerned sort of deity who created everything else, why is it that concept is so natural, comes so easily to so many cultures? Why does it emerge in very polytheistic contexts? It emerges in a rather natural way. So there seems to be a kind of a channel leading in that direction. And Northern Zion has a cultural evolutionary story that may help explain how it is that sort of concept comes to predominate. That cultures in which it has happened to emerge, perhaps accidentally, have been successful cultures and have grown and dominated the playing field, so to speak. So there are pro-social aspects to believing in such a being. This being knows what you're doing even when no one is watching. So that can be that can have very good effects within a society and give it advantages over rival cultures. Okay, so these are some of the standard tools. But how well do they do at explaining the existence of religious belief in our culture, especially when our culture is full of doubters, and when the option of disbelief is very real. Here, I think some of the negativity in the version of the paper that you read may be a little misguided. Some of the practitioners of CSR do not see themselves as aiming to explain how it is that, say, contemporary religious believers hold on to their beliefs in the face of their doubts, or how it is that religious experience that people still claim to have supports belief in God. They aim to explain those first phenomena I was mentioning, beliefs in supernatural beings and agents and spirits and so on, showing up all over the place. But the question remains, how well do we understand why ordinary people still today continue to believe in God? How much do these tools do? And here you find some anthropologists expressing some doubts. So Lerman, in this very nice study of some evangelical churches in the U.S., she says, if evolutionary psychology describes the way our intuitions evolved and explains why claims about invisible agents seem plausible and why certain ideas about God are found more often in the world than others, I should have said, it does this. She's allowing that it succeeds in doing this. But evolutionary psychology does not explain how God remains real for modern doubters. And she goes on to, in this fine study, to try to figure out what's going on. And she finds these tools not to be terribly helpful. And here's one of the CSR, one of the big names in CSR, saying, "We know next to nothing about the neurobiology of the vast majority of run-of-the-mill religious experiences and beliefs that sustain most people's faith." I didn't move on to that. So there's the quote that I just read. So where do contemporary people who believe the major monotheistic religions, where do they come by their beliefs? What do they think of, at least, as the sources? I mean, for one thing, testimony. They believe it because their grandparents or their parents told them these things. But also, religious experience plays an important role. Mystic strands exist within all the major and very many minor traditions. And a feature of much religious testimony is this is true, and if you pray, you go to church, you take, as Pascal would say, you take holy water, go to Mass, and so on, you will come to find yourself convinced. And often you will come to find yourself experiencing God. Now, I don't know that Pascal said, do these things and you will experience God. But certainly Pascal experienced God in a very powerful way. And that played an important role in his spiritual life. And it still does for many people today. I'm going to focus on religious experiences that are perception-like. This is a bit of just a choice. There's religious experiences. I think you guys apparently read some Plantinga. Plantinga's sensus divinitatis is a bit different from Alston's, which is the one I'm going to talk about. Plantinga's sensus divinitatis is more, you witness the wonders of nature, and this conviction forms in you, God made all this, or something like that. Which isn't exactly perception-like, but he does think it's a natural form of inference, just as natural as I look at Philip and I think he's awake. You know, it's not really an inference, but it's sort of an inference. I mean, it's based on the fact that his eyes are open and he's moving a little bit. But it's something like that, but it's natural, and it's presumably something that is automatic for all of us. And Plantinga thinks it's kind of like that something like that happens to religious people all the time. Alston's a little more interested in a different kind of experience. I think it may be because of Alston's encountering charismatic types of American religion, which he did back in the 70s, late 70s, where there's more emphasis than in the Dutch Reformed Church, say, on experiencing God, knowing God in a more direct way. So I'm going to talk about perception-like experiences of God, but this is a bit of an arbitrary choice. There's other kinds of religious experiences that also support people's beliefs in contemporary contexts that would also be worth thinking about. A broad spectrum of religious experiences that are seemingly perceptual or perception-like, in the direct, seemingly of God, not involving inference, are reported by contemporary people. And by contemporary, I here mean, modern, where that includes, go back as far as written history, really, but including our era. You have literal visions, the hearing of voices. You have experiences that are similar to a sensory modality, but not identical to it. So you have people reporting that they see, but not with their eyes. They hear, but not with their ears. And then there's more ineffable experiences where people just have a vivid sense of God's presence. It seems direct, undeniable, but they can't say that it's exactly like or very like any of the usual five senses. These are experiences that seem to have an experiential side to them. There's a way that it feels to be in them. They seem to be direct in the sense that they are of God, and there's not an inference from, oh, I feel this way again, therefore probably God is nearby. Which is an odd thing anyway, since God's supposed to be everywhere. But they're non-inferential, and they're taken to be of God. Let's look at some examples. And we're not being very adventuresome here. We're going back to William James, who collected a bunch of nice ones. But there's a really good source of data here in, I forget the name of the outfit in the UK, that has an incredibly vast source. It's a vast source of testimonies to religious experiences. Does anybody remember the name of this? Have you encountered this? It's huge, and it's searchable, and it's all online. Anyway, that's my fault for not remembering. But here's a typical case from James. All at once I felt the presence of God. I tell of the thing just as I was conscious of it, as if his goodness and his power were penetrating me altogether. Then slowly the ecstasy left my heart. That is, I felt that God had withdrawn the communion which he had granted. At bottom, the expression most apt to render what I felt is this: God was present, though invisible. He fell under no one of my senses, yet my consciousness perceived him. This I believe is a different one. As I turned and was about to take a seat by the fire, I received a mighty baptism of the Holy Ghost, without any expectation of it, without ever having the thought in my mind that there was such a thing for me, without any recollection that I had ever heard the thing mentioned by any person in the world. Of course, you can always be skeptical about these sorts of testimony. No doubt he had heard something about this. But never mind. The experience was unexpected and unsought, so it was perception-like in that respect as well. The Holy Spirit descended upon me in a manner that seemed to go through me, body and soul. I could feel the impression like a wave of electricity going through and through me. Indeed, it seemed to come in waves and waves of liquid love, for I could express it in no other way. Some of these testimonies from James, these 19th century testimonies, sound so much like things that I've heard described to me by people involved in the Jesus movement, the revival of the 1970s. Same words, same language. I mean, it sounds, waves of liquid love. It sounds like some bad pop song. But there's something similar going on here. A little more recent. In Lerman's study, she talked with a woman named Sarah. Sarah was willing to tell me that when she was praying and she felt God's presence moving through her body or in her mind, she felt extremely close to God, that is. When I'm praying for someone and I know that the words that are coming out of me aren't mine, and I know that the pictures that I'm seeing aren't mine, there's a real intense closeness and oneness that you feel. When Lerman asked her how she was able to relate to a being she could not see with her eyes, that she did feel as if she saw him. I feel like I do see him, and I do see his face, and I see his hand on what's going on around me. That is part of the experiential thing. Sometimes when I pray, I see his glory, and so on. Okay, so we could have used, we could go on and on. But these religious experiences are not rare, and they're not marginal. one can question the role they play. in supporting people's religious beliefs. One can say, oh, this is all confabulation, these don't really happen. People describe these things because they hear other people describe them and so on. I'm not so skeptical about them. I think they do happen, and they are important to people, and people hold on to them in the face of doubt, and they seek them out in the face of doubt. I think Lerman's study shows that. I mean, her study also shows that there's a lot of learning that goes into having these kinds of experiences and being sensitive to them. But there's a lot of learning that goes into recognizing a particular species of bird. We can all see birds, but I can't recognize a yellow-bellied sapsucker until I've learned some things. Surveys show that between 25% to 40% of people polled in America and Britain report having had some kind of religious experience in their lives. And these kinds of experiences are found with children as well as adults. There's a Finnish study, and it shows a decline in these experiences as there's a decline in religiosity of the general culture. But children and adolescents report experiencing God. Okay. Does CSR have much to say about this? Keeping in mind that perhaps it doesn't intend to. Perhaps that's not the real target. We think it doesn't take you very far in understanding them. The hyperactive agency detection device, the theory of mind mechanism, those seem to be the closest things to mental tools that are postulated as universal and available to everyone everywhere that would explain the experience of an invisible agent. And they can explain experiences like an agency detection tripwire being triggered, and you have a false positive, and you don't find a conventional agent, and so you infer that there's a non-conventional agent. But this doesn't seem to fit the experiences of the kinds that I'm describing. These are experiences often had in a very conventional environment where all the agents are known and there's no environmental cues that are being mistaken for agents. They often happen in one's bedroom when one's praying by oneself. Eyes are closed. There aren't any sounds that are being identified with an agent and so on. And so they have a different context. They also have a different content. Not a sense of danger or apprehension or readiness to seek out prey, but rather a sense often of feeling loved or known or cared about. Where does the richer content of these religious experiences come from? It's hard to see how standard CSR explains that. Now, no doubt, learning, being told by your priest or by your parents or someone to expect God to be there and to love you and so on. No doubt this plays a role, but that's not part of the CSR story. The very idea of a God of this sort who is invisible and everywhere and knows everything about you, Mark and I have been puzzling about how well CSR does at explaining the origin of this concept. Norton Zion's Big Gods story, there's some other authors working in this vein, they have more to say about how what seems to be a very complex concept of God could have developed over time and been available to us and be in play in these experiences. So they might explain the origin of the concept, but how it is that it gets hijacked into religious experiences per se, we don't think that classical CSR has a lot to say about that. Norton Zion, for instance, relies upon the typical hyperactive agency detector and theory of mind kicking in for the origins of beliefs in gods. So, what options are there if we want to do something that's like cognitive science of religion, but that takes seriously these widespread reports of perception-like encounters with God, that takes them seriously, perhaps more seriously than you'd believe that anyone might take them. So we're willing to go there. What would CSR look like, or an extension, let's say, of CSR? What would it look like if it understands these instances of belief formation in terms of experiential inputs, algorithms that work on these inputs, and then representational outputs in the style of cognitive science of, say, vision? What would it look like if it allowed that there might be something like a universal part of the mental toolkit, call it a God faculty, which delivers perception-like experiences of God in certain circumstances? And if one did find such a thing, I don't know if we'll get this far, but if one did find such a thing, what would be the upshot of that? Would it, if it was part of our innate cognitive endowment, would that increase our confidence that a God might actually exist? I don't know that I'm actually going to get that far. But that's something that Mark and I are very interested in. Okay. So let me there are there's something called neurotheology, which Michael Persinger, is that how you say his name? Do people know about this neurotheology? No. He's the guy who created a helmet, a God helmet. Dawkins famously put on the God helmet, and it's meant to by means of electrostimulation, or I don't know exactly how it's supposed to work. It's supposed to give you a sense of the presence of something, God or something godlike. Anyway, he's got the idea that there are events that happen in the brain that generate a sense of the presence, and that this could help to explain why people have these kinds of experiences. Well, that's the kind of thing that would be much more relevant from our point of view to these perception-like experiences. Now that work is super controversial. I've been trying to read some of it and some of the criticisms of it, and there's a lot of criticism that says the explanation is not the magnetic resonance or whatever the helmet's doing, as much as suggestibility of the subjects. Okay, so there's a lot of controversy about this. But it's the sort of thing that ought to be relevant to the question that Mark and I are interested in. And then there's other authors who also do brain imaging and try to figure out what exactly is going on in the brain when people are in meditative states or when people are having other unusual religious experiences. I'm not going to go into any of the details of any of that, and all of it seems very new, and it seems premature for me, anyway, to be saying anything about the value of particular lines of research. But I want to talk about kind of the philosophical question of what it would take for a kind of experience to count as perception of God. And my late colleague, William Alston, wrote a very important book called Perceiving God. Excellent book. Bill Alston was a terrific philosopher and a friend. So I'm going to rely on some of his work here and see if we can sort of bring it up to date and get some idea of what to look for if we were going to find a perception-like God faculty. Now, I'm going to rely in my thinking about perception upon what I'm calling the early modern stereotype of perception. I should keep track of the time here.
Never mind. Just
keep going?
Just keep going until you tell us all you have in mind.
Until I collapse and...
No, you're most generous. I know you're jet lagged, but please. Please.
I'm doing all right at the moment. It'll hit me suddenly, and when it does, you'll know. My head will drop, and that'll be it. Bill Alston was not himself a fan of this early modern stereotype. He took it seriously and discussed it as a possible way to understand perception, but he preferred a different kind of view. But we rather like the early modern stereotype. It takes it that when an external object is perceived by means of some sense modality, vision or smell or sense of feel, taste, or audition, there's a family of mental states associated with that mode of sensing. There's visual colors, experienced colors, there's tastes, there's sounds, and so on. These mental states from different sense modalities are caused by perceptible states of the object in a reliable, counterfactual, sustaining pattern, so that some differences in the objects perceived will cause systematic variations in the sensory experiences. So differences in the reflectances of surfaces cause different color experiences. And on the early modern conception of things, experienced color is one thing, physical surfaces and their patterns of absorption and reflectance, that's a different thing. That's a matter of the shapes of the molecules on the surface and what they absorb and what they reflect. Sensed experience, the colors, the qualia, that's another thing. Okay? And third, having these sensory experiences tends to cause their subject to believe that an object exists with the corresponding perceptible states. It doesn't always cause this. So if you tell me, oh, by the way, I've just given you LSD, I've just given you mescaline or something like that, and I have this experience as of an elephant in front of me, I don't believe that there's an elephant in front of me. But I do have a felt tendency to believe it, one that I have to suppress. So the early modern stereotype, as we're understanding it, has these three factors. Now there's a rival to this, which is probably more prominent in cognitive science itself, and is quite prominent in contemporary philosophy of mind, a reductive kind of representational theory of perception. So if you have a computational theory of the mind, you think that what the mind is essentially doing is it's computing. And there are internal states that are like the internal states of a computer. They are syntactically related. They push and pull one another around. So there's causal relations between them. They get their meanings somehow from causal interaction with the world. A standard version of this would be a kind of language of thought hypothesis, where there's some internal states of the brain that are inner words that get their meaning from some kind of of causal relationship with the subject in the world, the thing that they're about. In the case of perception, a reductive representational theory of perception says that some of these internal states are percepts. They get their meanings in virtue of being indicators of the thing that they're about. So a thermostat has an internal piece of metal that is an indicator of the temperature in the room. A frog has an internal state, which is an indicator of the presence of a fly. And there are, on this view, inner brain states which recur, and they mean red, and they mean sweet, and they mean bang, and they mean smooth and cold, and every perceptible kind of property. There's a brain state which is a percept of that. It gets its meaning from, in the typical versions of this view, like, for instance, Dretske and Tai, it gets its meaning from it's the fact that it's an indicator of these external things. Now, the nature of the indication, the causal relationship, gets very complicated. Tai and Dretske have complicated things to say about it, very interesting things to say about it. But roughly, on their view, when I see red, what's going on is that redness, I have a redness percept, and that is a brain state which has the meaning it does because of the role that this has come to play in my mental economy. Tai has a kind of teleological story to tell. In Tai's version, of course, you can think about redness without seeing it. You can so there must be something special about the redness percept. On his view, it's the fact that it's poised to cause behavior in certain ways, and poised to I forget what the expression is. He's got an acronym. He's got a nice acronym, but it's the functional role that it plays. Did someone remember what the acronym? Panic. Right, it's panic. Because you don't always panic, but panic stands for, I can't remember. But it's a nice theory. I'm going to ignore it for all its niceness. I'm going to ignore it. Alston also, in a footnote, mentions that there are these representational theories. Like Alston, I doubt the reducibility of the phenomenal to the representational. I think different phenomenal fields can represent the same physical properties, but there's a deep contingency between the phenomenal and the physical. The same phenomenal field can be hijacked to represent different external states in different people, or in the same person at different times. The same external state can be represented in phenomenally different ways for different people, or the same person at different times. So I'm going to set that sort of theory to one side and take the early modern kind of theory very seriously. Okay. So on the early modern stereotype, to recapitulate their sensory modes, they are distinct from what they represent about the world. So the question arises, how is it that they become connected with one perceivable state of affairs rather than another? How is it that the reddishness, being appeared to redly, as my old teacher Chisholm would say, how is it that being appeared to redly gets associated with redness, redness as a property of surfaces, as opposed to blueness, or as opposed to anything else? So you've got the sensory modes. They're distinct from what they represent about the world. Then you've got the fact that they're caused by the object of perception. And this is empirically supported. It was taken for granted in the early modern period. It was something they just thought they discovered. I think they did discover it. But this fact about causation isn't enough to settle what state it is that's perceived. Because the causal path between the curtains, the red curtains, and my experience of being appeared to redly, well, that's a long causal path. And there's light waves in between. There's the stimulation of my retina. There's also the light source. That's part of the cause. So which one of the causes is the one that I'm perceiving when I experience this reddishness? There's also the fact, on the early modern stereotype, that this experience of being appeared to redly generates beliefs about the object of perception, or at least tendencies to believe. And to look forward a little bit, what Goldman does is he uses this third fact to help explain which one of the many things that causes the reddish appearance is the thing that I perceive. So there's the three elements. If there were a sensus divinitatis, and here I'm using it to refer to the Alstonian kind of method or mode or sense of perceiving God. If the sensus divinitatis is going to fit the stereotype, there have to be analogs of a sensory mode of experience that are present when subjects claim to be perceiving God. God could well be the cause, and they certainly do generate beliefs about God. Alston makes all these points. Now, what could the modes of experience be? What do people say? How do they, when they're describing their experience phenomenologically, what do they say? Well, people describe quasi-sensory states. So, as in some of the examples that Alston gives, they talk about something that's like smelling, but it's not smelling. Something that's like a glow or a color, but it's not really seen with the eyes, and so on. They also often report emotional states or changes in affect, a sudden sense of being loved or being known, a sudden sense of being condemned, or there's the Jonathan Edwards sinners in the hands of an angry God sort of feeling. But sudden changes of affect are often thought of as part of sensing God. To be perception-like, these religious experiences have to produce belief or tendencies to believe automatically at a subpersonal level. So it's not an inference. If all of this is in place, cognitive science should be interested in looking for explanation of subpersonal and automatic processes in terms of inputs and outputs, computable functions. So let's talk about so basically what Mark and I are saying is people describe perception-like experiences. Let's take them seriously and ask what would have to be going on if there was perception of God. If what they're describing wasn't just, some quirky byproduct of the human brain. One good question here, which Alston worries about for a while, is what kind of causal contribution would be required if God were the perceived object in these kinds of experience? Alston says, it may well be pointed out that not every causal contributor to an experience is perceived via the experience. Thus, it is not enough that God figures somehow or other in the causes of the experience. God would have to make the right kind of causal contribution, but what is the right kind? In other words, what would make God the proper stimulus for a mode of sensing, as opposed to more mundane causes? Now, ideally, what we would have here is an analysis of the expression X is the perceptual object of S's experience of being appeared to Yly. Okay? Where Y is the mode of experience, let's say. The experience is as of being loved by someone who's near somehow. That's the Yly. What would it take for X, God, to be the perceptual object of my experience of that sort? This expression, X is the perceptual object of S's experience of being appeared to Yly, is a target of analysis in, for example, Chisholm's classic book, Perceiving. And he runs into the problem that he calls the problem of the proper stimulus. What is the proper stimulus for, say, vision? And there's all these stimuli that are causing me to be appeared to redly. There's the curtain, but there's also the light between the curtain and me. There's also the light source, which is striking the curtain, and that is part of the causal path. What makes one rather than another the proper stimulus? Why are the surfaces of objects, for instance, the proper stimulus for visual phenomenal experiences, rather than the surfaces of the retina? So after all, when I'm aware of the smoothness of the surface, well, maybe it's the surface that I'm aware of. But if I'm aware of heat, it's arguably my skin that I'm aware of. So when I'm aware of the reddish appearance of the curtains, why do we say it's the curtains that I'm aware of as opposed to the surface of the retina? After all, that's being directly stimulated, and it carries the information that is being computed by the brain. The visual sensations contain at least as much information about retinal stimulation and the light that's, say, 2 inches in front of my eyes as they do about physical objects. So finally, we have a picture. Okay, so we have the sun. That sun looked to me like it was from a Raisin Bran commercial. That's why it had a friendly kind of feel, familiar feel. You have the sun, you have the orange, you have on the early modern stereotype of perception, you have the orangish visual image, or the being appeared to orangely experience, which is something inside of my head, or something in me, anyway. What is it that makes the surface of the orange the object of perception, rather than, why don't we say, I see the sun? The sun, after all, is in the causal history of my orangish experience. Alvin Goldman wrote a very nice paper called The Objects of Perception, in which he proposed a theory that I thought was quite ingenious and may well be true. Goldman gives us a kind of recipe for figuring out what the perceptual object is of a certain sensory modality. Ask what kinds of beliefs are typically caused by the mental states associated with a particular sense modality, and what proportion of those beliefs are true. Then ask what kinds of things are most of these true beliefs about, and what relationships do they stand in to the perceiver when true beliefs about them are formed. We have answered all those questions. The relationship that those things stand in gives you the relationship in which the thing on the other end of that relationship, it's that kind of thing which is the object of perception. So in the case of vision, it's going to turn out that the thing that stands on the other end of that relationship is the surfaces of objects, for the most part. So what kind of beliefs are generally caused by this kind of orangish experience? Beliefs about orange surfaces. And because most of the time when true beliefs like that are formed, the object that satisfies them is a surface out there. It's oranges that you see, and not light sources, and not the the retina or the light that's between you and the orange. So the relationships in question are going to be causal ones between some properties of some things and the subject of the experiences. Things that stand in those relationships are then the proper stimuli for that kind of experience in that subject. So the relationship in question is the one that's indicated in blue there. It's the relationship of reflected light from a surface that strikes the retina and causes orangish experience. It's not that relationship, the relationship between the light source and the orangish experience. Now, it might be if our mental economy was set up in a different way, if the functional role of orangish experiences was very different, it might be true to say, when I have an orangish experience, what I see is the light source. So if this was the belief that was typically caused whenever I see an orange, ooh, a light source. Well, then light sources might be what I see. So suppose someone had very poor discrimination, and every time there's any kind of light, whether it's red or blue or orange or whatever, they think the lights are on. And that's it. Well, a creature that was wired like that, on Goldman's theory, as I understand it, a creature that was wired like that would be perceiving light sources. Now, maybe to be like that, you'd have to be like a very simple sensory device that just is able to direct itself towards a light source. But in any case, it's the role of the orangish experience in your mental life which makes oranges the object, orange surfaces the object, and not the source. So why is it that what you see is not the light that's 2 inches from your eyes? Well, maybe if that was the kind of belief typically caused by this sort of orangish experience, maybe that is what you would perceive. But that's not the kind of belief that's typically caused. Why isn't it your retinas? Why isn't the relationship between retinal stimulation and the orange experience? Why isn't that the relationship that shows you the proper stimuli for an orange experience? Well, because we don't form beliefs like, oh, my retina is orange now. So that's the way Goldman's theory works, roughly. And this is both literally and figuratively a caricature of his theory. It's much more complicated than that. But the idea is experiences of redness, orangeness, etc. have a tendency to produce directly, non-inferentially, largely true beliefs about the properties of the surfaces of objects, not about the wavelengths of light striking the eye or traveling between an object and the eye. And this fact explains why red experiences in normal conditions are perceptions of the surfaces of objects and not of the properties of the retina or of the light itself. Okay, so that's the theory. What would it take for God to be, in fact, the proper stimulus for some family of experiences? So, by hypothesis, the way people are describing their experiences, there's some way that it feels, many, many ways that it feels, when they take themselves to be directly aware of God. Apparently this person is having kind of a musical note. But in fact, one of the things that we were particularly interested in, Mark and I, was the idea that affective states might be playing the role of the internal modifications by which one is aware of God. So people describing sense of being loved, sense of awe, attentiveness, together with quiescence. There's various descriptions of moods or feelings layered on top of one another, these might provide a kind of vocabulary for different types of experiences of God. But in any case, some kind of modification is felt. What would it take for that to be a perception of God? If Goldman's right, at least the following necessary conditions must hold. 1, the experiences in question must typically generate beliefs that are uniquely satisfied by God. And 2, there must be a causal relationship between God and the experiences. But what causal relationship between God and subject would suffice for the experience to be perception of God? 2 possibilities present themselves. Some special divine activity beyond mere concurrence, that is, the activity that God is supposed to be always engaged in supporting the existence of everything. Or, by contrast, the same causal contribution God is supposed to make to everything that happens. The second seems more problematic. Let's talk about the first. What would it take for God to be the proper stimulus? Well, suppose that there were some special divine activity beyond mere concurrence. It could take at least 2 forms. A kind of direct intervention in the brain, God jiggling the neurons, and this should be something that we should find in the lab, presumably. If God is jiggling the neurons, something is going on there. So we should find evidence of this. To the extent that we don't, it's evidence that it's not happening. But there it is, there's a picture of it. God sort of zapping the person. If that were the case, I've made the lightning bolt blue there to indicate, as in the other cases, that this is the causal relationship that is giving you the proper stimulus for this mode of experience. You've got the mode of sensing, and you've got the cause of it, and the cause is believed to be God. And if God exists and is the cause, then it satisfies the proper stimulus condition. There's another way in which there could be some special divine activity beyond mere concurrence, which was the causal relationship between that mediates the causal relationship between God and the experience. And that would be a kind of planting of triggers for the mode of experience. So if God sort of providentially sets up signposts, as it were, which cause this mode of experience, then God stands at the back of this causal chain. God is believed to be the cause by the person, and the triggers are sort of intermediary. So maybe you see the nature, you see the rainbow, whatever, and zing, it causes this experience. If that was intended by God, and what's caused is a belief that God exists and is present. Well, God is present everywhere, and God is the cause. It's unclear what in Goldman's theory would not be satisfied to make God the proper stimulus.
5 minutes, please.
Okay. You might think of it as like a skunk that's invisible or that's very good at hiding. The skunk leaves a smell when it wants you to notice it. Your olfactory sense is stimulated, and you have this experience. And if, in fact, you immediately form the belief, skunk, that's a perception of skunk, and it's triggered by the skunk on purpose. Okay. I'm really interested in this idea, the idea that you don't really need God to jiggle the neurons or even set up signposts. That God just contributes the same causal concurrence to your experience as God contributes to everything. And that's enough for God to count as the proper stimulus. So God's upholding everything. The orange, the sun, the experience in your head. Why don't we then perceive God in every experience? Why is visual experience not perception of God, or the smell of a skunk? Well, because visual experiences don't typically constitute perception of light sources, or the light traveling to your eyes, or the state of your retina, or God's existence. And it's all for the same reason. These things don't satisfy Goldman's conditions for being the proper stimulus of perception by means of visual experience. They don't tend to cause belief in the sun or belief in God. So, when you follow Goldman's recipe for finding the relationship that determines the proper stimulus for visual experience, the relationships will not be the causal relationships that hold between these things, the source, the light rays, the retinas, or God, even though there are causal relationships between them and the experience. If there's a family of quasi-sensory states or emotional states that regularly generate beliefs about God, and many of these beliefs are true, and they are in some way caused by God, even if only in a very generic way, then God could be the proper stimulus for perceptual experience involving these states, without God's being the proper stimulus for all perceptual experiences. Okay, so that's all sort of purely philosophical groundwork for the, you might call it prolegomena to a future cognitive science of religion that would look for, in an optimistic way, a perceptual mode of experiencing God. It shows, if it shows anything, that such experiences could count as perception. It doesn't show that it's there. It doesn't show that it's hardwired and universal. Those are further interesting questions, which I will have to leave for discussion because I'm not.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. This is most intriguing. I mean, you are thinking aloud with us, right? So thank you very much for sharing fresh ideas and fresh avenues of consideration. Of course, I'm sure that everyone, or many of us here, would have questions or comments to make. I mean, my only comment in a preliminary way is that, all to talk about the eye of the heart and so forth, right? You are taking seriously the question of the attribution of perception to this particular agent, and a question that would ultimately need to be asked at the end of the day is, and you've gone to a lot of trouble to look into this, is precisely why one should take this seriously. But that is a different question altogether. Please.
It reminds me of a question I was once asked when I gave a talk about whether resurrection was possible.
Yes.
And a guy from the seminary across the street across the street from the university where I was speaking raised his hand, and his question was, "Why should I care about anything you say?" And it wasn't quite that, but it was. It was in the same ballpark.
No, and I would vigorously counter any such suggestion.
Yeah,
anyway,
Vlad,
please, yeah, Vlad.
I'm wondering why you have to go all the way into this demonstration of God as stimulus when Luhrmann, for example, finds an easier explanation to the quasi-perception of God in her work that you quote, which is mental imagery cultivation, so imagination, right? She says, and also does various experiments with that, all mystical traditions have techniques of visualization in which you feel the presence, you sense, you see something that you call God, but in fact it is a product of certain techniques of mental imagery cultivation. So your pseudo perception is there, but it's not necessary to have a stimulus. That's the point of it. So what's the point of the argument except for proving God is a stimulus?
I think that to the extent that an experience is it seems to be the product of deliberately bringing up images and learning to interpret them in a certain way. And you're absolutely right that this is a big part of Luhrmann's story of how this religious community comes to report the experiences of God that they report. Okay? But to the extent that the experience is deliberately cultivated interpretation of images that one calls up oneself, it's less perception-like, much less perception-like. And I think...
Degree?
What's that?
The degree? She
She
also has a scale to measure hallucinations, right? So
I think the more it's like an unprompted hallucination, the more reason there is to take it seriously as perception. So to take the one example from James, according to that person anyway, he didn't have any expectation of having such an experience. It was unsought. It was overwhelming, and in that sense, it was perception-like. And I think that if you believe in God and you take yourself to be supposed to attend to what may be attempts on God's part to be present to you, then this sort of learning that Luhrmann describes, you could reasonably take this to be training your senses in the way that someone who learns how to identify the grape and the vintage of wine. That takes a lot of learning, right? And you can have doubts about that too. You can have in the case of wine tasting, and our grad students had a blind beer tasting, and it turned out they all liked Budweiser, but they claimed to have very refined tastes in beer. So you can be skeptical about these learned methods of identifying something that seems perceptual, might not really be there. So I totally understand, especially many of Luhrmann's stories, or the explanations that she's giving. It's easy to doubt whether they're doing anything other than conjuring up images and giving a kind of religious gloss to them. And so I don't expect people to take the experiences of that religious community as evidence that God must exist. Take their testimony. On the other hand, there are plenty of reports of powerful religious experiences that are unsought, at least not consciously sought. Those are more stereotypically perception-like. I would take this to be a kind of a spectrum. So the most unsought, striking, and belief-generating kinds of experiences seem to me to be very perception-like. And if there is a God, and if God designed the method by which they come about, it's hard to see how they would not qualify as perception. But I grant you're absolutely right about Lerman's book, and what Mark and I think about it is that some of her own anecdotes and some of the cases that she describes don't fit so well her explanatory paradigm, which is that it's all learned. At least according to some of her informants, they were shocked, surprised, didn't know what to make of it. There were experiences that were overwhelming and not deliberately sought, and they weren't deliberately taught how to interpret them. But I don't at all doubt the value of that work, and I think a lot of what she's explaining is she understands what's going on there very well. But I do think that there's plenty of experiences that are hard to it's hard to press them into that paradigm.
Yeah, to that paradigm. Of course, there are quite a number of others which would step into the void which is being filled by a theistic causal explanation. But of course, it's not now for me to engage you in a discussion. Over to you, sir.
I found your discussion of how to understand perception of God at the end intriguing, very suggestive. But the excursus through the philosophy of perception, somewhat less so. It's a controversial area.
Yeah.
If there isn't a consensus, probably the hegemonic view, certainly in the United States, is some variant of the Thai Dritz
Yes.
view, not early modern. They would say they've
Right.
gone beyond the early modern. Personally, I think they're still working within that paradigm, and that's a fundamental problem, actually, for their theories. But Goldman's theory seems to me to be somewhat question-begging in that he presupposes a grasp of a content of belief, which then somehow gets you out there, whereas I would perhaps want to turn it the other way around and say it's perception, what's out there, which gives you the content of belief, which would be rather problematic, I think, for the Golden theory. Anyway, the point is...
Yeah, there's a worry about circularity there, for sure.
Circularity and, more than that. But there are other theories, as you know, not least a direct realist theory or Howard's sense data theory. There's a variety of different theories. I can see the virtues of drawing on these to understand the specific, difficult issues around perception of God, but it seemed to me to weaken your case to, as it were, suggest that there was one particular theory, Goldman's theory, that was particularly correct about perception that was not of God, as it were.
Yeah. I thought of myself as making things kind of hard for us by assuming... so I think Alston makes things a little too easy for himself by assuming a kind of... It's a sort of direct realist theory that he's got. He thinks that perceiving is always a matter of a relation holding between you and the perceived object, and there are different relations corresponding to the different modes of appearing. And so he calls it the theory of appearing. And he takes it that one of the ways of appearing might be just a quasi-sensory relation that holds between you, your mind, and God. And when that holds, then you're perceiving God. If it holds between you and something else, then you're not perceiving God. And it could, in principle, hold between you and something else. I thought we sort of made it a little harder on ourselves by assuming, and I take it that Howard Robinson's sense data theory would be a version of the early modern view, except I'm going to believe in the objects out there that aren't just made up out of sense data, that are causing the sense data. And I thought, in a way, I was making it sort of harder on us and looking for an analysis that would give the result that God was the object, as opposed to just kind of assuming that there's a relationship that, in the good case, holds between you and God. What Alston sort of says is, well, God's got to be the cause. Other than that, it's just a brute fact whether or not the relation of appearing lovingly to you holds between God and you. And I sort of wanted it to fall out of an analysis. But you're right that it's burdening our theory with a controversial theory of perception.
Please.
Thank you. So I have a short historical remark and then a question about the initial problem setting, methodological speaking. The short historical remark is that if we take the early modern theory of perception very seriously, I think still the best interpretation of it is occasionalism, which gives you a very direct route to God. Of course, it's not the same as this one, since it's inferential, but that would mean that any bit and piece of experience requires God's as direct stimulus. And I think the occasionalist interpretation, if you work, I don't know whether it speaks for or against the early modern interpretation, but I think if you take the early modern interpretation seriously, you believe that that's a possibly good model, and I think occasionalism should be taken very seriously because it's the best way to do that. But that's just a historical thing. There is another question about the whole issue as it was raised. So you started off by saying that there is data about many people having such experience, and I'm not questioning that. But when we usually think about the problem of perception, that I saw that I'm not a cognitive scientist, but I would think that the normal assumption is that most people do the same thing. So unless there is some, so if someone, I don't know, misidentifies colors regularly, okay, then it means that there's some defect or something went astray, and we have to find out. And usually we try to give an explanation why this happens, or why people systematically miss colors or whatever. And but in the case you mentioned, no matter how large this number is, this 25 to 60 or something, 50-60%, it's still not. You can still not say that that's the norm. So here, from which it is a deviation when people actually never see such thing, even in very proper or appropriate circumstances, you would expect to have it. So I'm not saying it's I don't want to draw any conclusion from this to your project, but I think it has to be taken into account that it's still something very special, and therefore it's different from the thing when you want to understand normal, and what is normal and what is very special. And that's, I think, is also a difference between what you said about the general studies, which all assume that, you know, generally we should have something like that, etc., etc. Still, this kind of experience you use or rely on still seems to be special, even if there is enough evidence that people have it. So I don't want to deny that. The very fact that it's special distinguishes it, I think, from normal cases of perception or common sense belief formations or something like that. So that's a methodological point I wanted to mention.
I think one thing that I want to say is that this is kind of tangential to what you're saying. So there's widespread belief in God. And often, in the absence of these kinds of experiences, you still have lots and lots of people believing in God. And I do think, and I think Mark wouldn't want to deny this either, that the usefulness of cognitive science of religion as it exists for explaining the prevalence of God beliefs and the way they spread, and perhaps the Norn Zion story about the pro-social effects of belief in big gods. This may help to explain that kind of widespread belief and thereby undermines a kind of consensus gentium argument that goes, people have always believed in God, most people do still believe in God, so probably God exists. Okay? So that sort of argument, we're granting that ordinary CSR may well have an effect upon that. So if you're trying to figure out whether God exists by taking votes, by tallying numbers, this should affect your judgment about how likely it is that God exists. Now, the question of whether the fact that there isn't universal religious experience that sort of creates a tendency to believe that God is present in this perceptual way, does the non-universality of that suggest that the people who have it are not aware of God? That's a really interesting question that you're raising. And one way to put pressure, turn that into a kind of pressure, is to say, if there were a God, and God were, as you say, cares about everybody, wants to know everybody, wants to be in communion with everyone, then everybody would have this experience. The fact that they don't proves there's no God. Okay? But you could just use it as a part of the problem of evil. Because if God exists, this would be bad. And so God probably doesn't exist. So, and that's a very traditional part of the problem of evil. It gets called the problem of divine hiddenness. I'm sure you've bumped into that expression. So, if there's no explanation why God would be hidden, even partly hidden from anybody at any time, then you have an argument that God doesn't exist based on the non-universality of this kind of perception.
I didn't want to say anything about big questions. I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
I just wanted to say that even if it's one thing to say that some people have religious experience, it's another thing to say that it is like perception.
Uh-huh.
And where my question wanted to go is that one reason why people would say that it is like perception is that in normal cases when we investigate perception, we think that there are normal conditions which, unless there is an explanation, people will share the same kind of perceptual experience. this seems to be absent in the case of
Yeah.
you talk about, and therefore one may think that even if there is religious experience, it's not exactly like cases of perception. So that was my
Right.
so that's denying it.
Yeah, if I may just add a little thing. I mean, what you were suggesting in your response to the point made about Daniel Luhrmann is that each of these experiences that might claim not to have been learned, not to have been the result
The
of
more
some kind of
spontaneous.
yes, that each is actually autonomously solipsistic, as it were. Now, if it were to be autonomously solipsistic, how can it actually then articulate itself? I do not really quite understand, except in terms which are mimetically, as it were, available. That would bring in Dennett on memes, right?
Autonomously solipsistic?
Yes. So each is a monad. Each is unlearned, and therefore hardly transmissible. You see. Except that it expresses itself by means of analogy, right, or by means of borrowed vocabularies. The model of perception that we've been shown rests on a number of analogies, and of course analogies are extremely useful instruments for thinking, but they are ultimately rhetorical. And a rhetorical statement is a statement which, by definition, cannot be restated non-rhetorically, as it were. So it actually then remains. It remains imprisoned. It becomes intransitive, right?
You mean
ultimately
non-transmissible?
Yes, non-transmissible. Yes.
Well, so I think one can perceive a bird without, and it's a yellow-bellied sapsucker, but you don't perceive it to be such. You learn more about birds, you acquire more concepts, and you can see the same bird, and you can say more about it, and you can recognize it, and your perception of it becomes more articulated. So I would take it that experiences can be of God and be inchoate, and not, if the person doesn't have the concepts to apply, it still could be de re, as it were, of God, but not fully articulated. And I don't think that makes it not perceptual. And when it is more fully articulated, the fact that one needed these further concepts in order to flesh it out doesn't show that it isn't perceptual. So I want to say something like that.
Yes.
That there's a spectrum of concept-laden perception. And the fact that some things have to be in your conceptual repertoire before you can perceive them doesn't show that it's complete projection.
Okay. May I take one last question, please?
Thank you for your talk. Well, I have a very brief question. It is related to the distinction you drew between religious experience, in a sense, and the vocabularies by virtue of which we talk about perception. So what is your criterion, or what are your criteria in your account for recognizing between veridical and non-veridical perceptions of God in one's report?
So, well, in general, I would think a perception is veridical if... So first of all, it's got to be a perception, which means there's a sort of there's an experiential side to it, and it represents the world as being a certain way, and then the world has to actually be that way. So just in general, that would be veridical perception. So if you have veridical perception of God, there's a mode of sensing which seems to you to be of God, it leads to beliefs that God is a certain way. And if God actually is that way, and is at the causal back of the experience, then it's veridical. So I wouldn't think the criteria for veridical perception of God would be different from the criteria for veridical perception of tables and chairs. It's just, of course, much harder to have any confidence that they obtain, that these conditions obtain, that they're really the case. And especially when people have such they make radically different claims about what God is like. So they can't all be right. They may all be partly right. So I grant that veridicality here is very difficult to judge.
Please, you want to follow?
Yes. Just to... Okay, if somebody says that I can see a table in front of me, I can verify that in different ways.
Uh-huh.
But there is no such a kind of method for verifying any kind of claim about experiencing any divine kind of entity. And if you are comparing perceptual experience of a table with that of an entity called God, then we should be able to verify both of them in similarly the same ways.
Well, if God was a physical object, then yes, but God's not supposed to be a physical object. And problems of veridicality arise for all kinds of cognition and intuition about ethics and all kinds of things like that. So the fact that that there's controversy, I think, shouldn't rule out the possibility that there's perception. Just to sort of point you in the direction of someone who's written on this, Alston's book, Perceiving God, the last third of it, or half of it, maybe it's the second half of it, is about the question of whether there are independent methods of testing purported perceptions of God. And he decides, well, that there are methods. People use methods. They compare, reports with one another, and there are traditions of how to interpret experiences that seem to be of God. And he makes the case that it's not that different from ordinary perception. It is. You're right. It's very different. We have many different senses that enable us to get at the table, where with perception of God, it's a lot hairier. But he does want to say there are what he calls doxastic practices, by means of which we try to test our experiences for veridicality. It's something to look at anyway. I don't buy the whole. I'm not sure I buy the whole package, but it's a serious piece of work anyway.
Well. Thank you very, very much indeed. This has been most stimulating to all of us.
You've been very patient and kind.
No, you're the one who's given us so much time and energy. And now you can, there are a couple of bottles beckoning you at the other end of the... Yes.